Hey everyone, it's Tim here for another update. I hope you're doing well. And to start things off, we're going to continue with the next chapter of our book that we've been working through, Pentecostal Outpourings. And this chapter has to do with Ireland. The chapter is called Melting the Ice of a Long Winter, Revival and Irish Descent by a guy named Ian Hugh Clary. And really, essentially, this is a chapter that's a tale of two revivals. And there's a little bit of stuff in between that we won't spend a lot of time on. But the first revival happened in the 17th century, and this is the Puritan era. And the second big revival happened in the 19th century, really the year 1859. It was all contained within that one year. But this first revival was called the 6 Mile Water Revival. It took place in the 1620s and 30s. To give you a little bit of background, the Protestant Reformation, which had really taken off in the 1500s, in England was very successful. The state church broke away from Rome, and there was an Anglican state church there. There was a Church of Ireland that was kind of trying to do the same thing in Ireland, but it wasn't nearly as successful. The Roman Catholic Church remained very well entrenched in Ireland. And for some political reasons that we don't have time to get into, in the early 1600s, King James, whose name you probably recognize from the King James Bible, moved some Scottish Protestants into Northern Ireland, an area called Ulster. And the Scottish Protestants were from the Presbyterian denomination. And from our standpoint, from the standpoint of sound doctrine, biblical doctrine, for the players that are around in the area at this time, these would be the good guys. Okay, these would be the people who we'd have most in common with theologically. And so some Protestant Presbyterian Scots start settling in Ireland, and among them are some pastors, and they start planting some churches. And it's really cool. There begins to be a Presbyterian presence there in Ireland, and the Church of Ireland welcomes them. The Church of Ireland's trying to move things in a reformed direction, and so these aren't they don't necessarily agree on every single thing, but they see these Presbyterians as a very good thing, a very good influence there in the church in Ireland. We should just take a pause and say at this point, they didn't have the concept that we do now of pluralism, of different denominations that can all coexist, and there's not a state church. This is an idea that fits really well with how the Bible presents the gospel. But at this point, they're basically trying to fight about what denomination the state church, the established church, is going to be. So that's just maybe some helpful background here. But so this is a situation. In 1623, something really interesting happens. There is one of these Scottish Presbyterians in Ireland named James Glendinning. He's a really eccentric guy, and he's not a very good pastor, but one thing he does very well is preach the law. So he starts preaching the law and not the gospel. So this idea of he preaches the law, the way the law is supposed to condemn us, show us our need of Christ, show us our guilt and our condemnation before God, to prepare the way to hear of Christ and our need of him. Glendinning did a bang-up job of convincing his hearers that they were guilty. And so he left all these people going, what do we do to be saved? They were devastated over their sin. That God was clearly working in them. But he just kind of flaked and left and never preached the gospel. So some other ministers nearby saw what was happening, and thankfully were like, we got to get in there and help these people. So they get in and they start holding these meetings where they make the gospel very clear. This is basically the Puritan era. So these are Puritan type guys preaching the gospel very clearly, and then what the Christian life looks like for those who receive Christ. And God seemed to really bless it. There was a lot of fruit there, a lot of people receiving Christ. There was a lot of people just even already believers, but stirred up toward more zeal for holiness and following Christ. And what's interesting about the Presbyterians were known for having a really simple worship style. Really, the things they emphasized were expository preaching, so a long, biblically dense sermon, psalm singing. They sang out of the book of Psalms. And then the ordinances. They made a big deal. They didn't do communion very often. They did it maybe like once a year, but it was a huge event. And so essentially these ordinary means of grace. And what happened was God was blessing the ordinary means of grace. And there was just a very evident fruitfulness of the gospel and many people coming to Christ. There were also some very extreme kind of physical manifestations. There were people who would be weeping, sobbing, crying out just with the anguish of of their guiltiness, and then in the midst of hearing the law and coming to Christ. There were people who were kind of struck as though they were dead for some time, just some really extreme manifestations. And so there was some criticism, both on a theological level from, say, some Roman Catholics and other Protestants who were less Calvinistic, more Arminian. And then there were some criticisms there in Ireland over the effects and pointing to it and saying, oh, this seems to be all a bunch of enthusiasm. It doesn't seem to be a work of God. So there were some figures within this this revival that were really out defending the revival and saying, yeah, it's definitely a danger that there can be satanic deception that mixes in here. There can be enthusiasm and zeal and excitement that isn't related to true work of God and true conversion and things like that. There's a guy named Robert Blair. He has a quote here. Robert Blair seemed to have played a role common to Jonathan Edwards and Gilbert Tennent 100 years later, that's in America, in keeping the revival honest. So he came in and said, look, this is really a work of God, but we need to exercise some discernment and say that not everything that's happening is necessarily truly a work of God. There needs to be some biblical discernment required. But what happened, some political events happened that kind of changed the situation. Essentially, to make things pretty succinct, there was new leadership in the Church of England that really took a stance of persecution against the more reformed side of Protestants, of the Presbyterians. So they began a campaign of persecution against these Scottish Presbyterians. Some of them folded and went along with the program of kind of pulling back on the Reformation. Some of them went back to Scotland and just kind of as refugees went back there. And then others kind of went underground in terms of they left their established ordained posts and they went around as itinerants. And in God's amazing providence, this kind of became a means of spreading the influence of the revival even more broadly. In 1641, yet more political changes occurred, and the outcome of all of it was that there was more religious toleration granted in Ireland. So finally, there was an ability for the Presbyterians to have space to function again and not be persecuted. So some of those who had gone to Scotland came back, and there really began a separate Scottish Presbyterian denomination that wasn't, again, vying to be the Church of Ireland. There was, I should say, an Irish Presbyterian church that kind of was a legacy of all that. In the century in between, the 1700s, won't talk long about, the author talks a little bit about a Methodist and Baptist activity. The upshot of all of this, both from the 6 Mile Water Revival in the 1600s, some of these Methodist and Baptist activities, and some revival that occurred there in the 1700s, left the Irish church, the Irish Evangelical Church, with a real tenor of expectation of revival. This is just something that was part of the atmosphere there. Moving ahead to the 1850s, there was this event called the Ulcer Awakening that happened in 1859. For some background, you may have heard of the Irish famine that occurred in the 1840s into early 1850s. This was a catastrophic event. Their potato crop that they relied so much on was blighted by a fungal disease, and the result was 1 million people died, and 1.5 million immigrated out of Ireland, many of them to the United States. There's a big wave of Irish immigration to our shores. So this is a backdrop. So there's some real desperation and probably spiritual preparation here. A lot of sense of people being brought face to face with death and eternal things, the way that disaster can humble us in God's providence. Another thing that was going on was there was some revival that started in the United States in the 1850s. And this was a revival of a character that was a little bit different. I've talked in some past videos about this idea of men. This is something that really started in the 1830s and beyond in America. A guy named Charles Finney was a big pioneer of this. People basically saying we can adopt certain methods that can make revival happen. And instead of this being something that necessarily that God does, that he just blesses ordinary means in extraordinary ways, there can be a sense in which we can use extraordinary means to get to the same result. This is going to happen where you have Arminianism. It's more likely to happen where you have Arminianism, a view that ultimately man's free will is what decides who comes to Christ rather than God's sovereign election. But anyway, this revival spread into Ireland in the 1859. It was characterized by a big emphasis on prayer meetings, which is great. Also an emphasis on the activity of lay leaders, meaning non-clergy. and certainly don't want to despise the fruitfulness of ordinary believers who are not pastors and clergy. The problem is that lay people were moving into very prominent roles of like teaching and preaching and things that were not equipped for. And so it really ended up opening the way for a lot of theological confusion. Basically, someone just had to have a really epic religious personal experience, and suddenly they could kind of get up and become a leader and start their own following. So there was a lot of that kind of chaos, doctrinal confusion happening. And there was a major emphasis on experience, a major emphasis on that sort of groundbreaking personal conversion experience. Again, because the character of it was that we can kind of make this happen. It was the measuring stick of what God was doing. And so there tended to be a doctrinal minimization, and there tended to be a more maximization of experience. And along with that came some, and I talked about in the 6 Mile Water, there were some things like people almost being struck as though dead for some time. There were some sobs and just extreme physical reactions. There was that here in the 1859, but there was also some more things that we would see from a biblical standpoint being problematic. A lot of reports of strange visions, people having of encounters with God and the devil. There were people that were claiming to have what are called stigmata, or they're sharing the wounds of Christ, these kind of miraculous appearances of Christ's wounds on them. Some really strange claims that were being made that were associated with this. It all came and went within that 1 year. And the legacy of this revival seemed to be that kind of doctrinal minimization. The church was de-emphasized, personal experience, personal piety, and intense religious experience came to be more emphasized in the Irish evangelical churches moving on from this revival. So some not great effects that came from it. Don't want to deny that God truly was working there in some people's lives. This stuff historically is very complicated. We want to draw things as either very black or very white. Certainly there was some satanic deception, and there was some kind of false fruit happening there in the 6 Mile Water revival, and there probably was some true work of God in regenerating lost people and bringing people to greater faith and obedience who already knew Christ there in the 1859 revival. But in kind of surveying these two revivals, like I said, our author does kind of pit them against each other by way of contrast. And he ends by bringing up this category that a writer named Ian Murray introduced in the 1990s, writing about revival. And his book is called Revival and Revivalism. And his whole thesis is that these two categories that are really helpful to distinguish. Revival being the thing we've talked about a lot here, which is God bringing extraordinary fruit to ordinary means. It's something that God does, a spontaneous and surprising work of God. Revivalism being that man-generated, response-driven, we can engineer revival kind of a thing. And I like the way the author says this. The distinction is sometimes made between revival prayed down and revival worked up. So it looks like the 6 Mile Water revival is the kind that's prayed down, that's really a work of God sovereignly, whereas the worked up kind is more what we saw in the 1800s. So that's what happened there in Ireland, and I look forward to next week getting into the next chapter. But with that, we'll go ahead and transition to some announcements for us as a church. Greg's still on his sabbatical, and he's coming back from his visit to his dad in Wisconsin back to Sacramento, so he's going to be really diving deep into his research that he's doing his sabbatical for. We have Sunday, our equipping hour at 9 o'clock, continuing our series on meeting with God. 10:30, corporate worship. 5 o'clock, we have our community groups in various homes, and you can find info about where that is in the newsletter. And also in the newsletter, you'll see info on prayer meetings, upcoming conferences, there are quite a few, and family camp in July, as well as other events. I also want to highlight the Membership Matters class that's coming up for anyone who is maybe just curious about finding out more about our church, or maybe knows that they're interested in membership. It's a great class to learn more about what we believe, what we practice, and what the New Testament teaches about church membership in general. So there's info on that too. That's coming up later this month. So with that, I'll say goodbye. Hope you all have a great rest of your week, and look forward to seeing you Sunday.